Hey everyone and welcome to Squidly Bits. This is our second channel where we do quicker, more improvised videos, and today we are going to check our Patreons' miniatures and give feedback to those and help them improve so that their next mini can be even better. And today we're going to start with Ed from Australia and his lovely version of Cion and Dea. And we've already done a feedback round on this one. Not on this channel, obviously, but in the Patreon group. But this is his updated version and he's added more gold. So we're going to talk a bit about the gold, but also a little bit about the skin, even though if the skin is starting to look really nice. So let's just dive into it. Okay, so first of all, as I said, the skin is already looking quite good, which is a really nice thing. We've got a nice transition where you have the brightest area at the center of the mini, so the belly, the chest and the face is brighter generally than the things around it. We have nice light placements, but if we want to push it just a tiny bit more, we can do so. So I'm going to go a little bit more into yellow than the green he has today, just because adding colors in there that are slightly warmer than the shadow tones. It's going to make the contrast bigger between the shadows and highlights. That's often why I sometimes add like a blue shadow to orc skin tone, even if I make the highlights green, because then we have a stronger contrast between the brightness and the shadows. The general shape is really nice, but we are kind of lacking in texture on the belly. So I'm going to just draw in some textures in here so we can define the muscles even a tiny bit more than he has today. Just get in a little bit of that local highlights. So something like this. You see how that just adds a little bit more punch to the surfaces to make them feel like they are reflecting a little bit light. You can do the same up here on his pectoral muscles. Just add a little bit of a brighter spot that punches the light a little bit more up here and up here. And the reason why we are placing it on this area here is because we got like a cylindrical shape and we want the light to be on the very top of that cylindrical shape. So we place them on the very edge of the muscle above it, similar to this. And on this one, again, it's like a sphere slash cylinder, so we make it go across the cylinder. And with just these two steps, you don't have to push it as hard if you don't want to, but just adding this like extra highlight that makes the skin go boom is something that really adds a lot to your miniatures. And we don't want to add this highlight to every single part of its body, because if we add the same highlight everywhere, it's going to feel like everything has the same brightness and it's going to lose some of that contrast. But I'm adding a little bit of it to his leg just to bring up the brightness a tiny bit. So he's done a really nice job connecting the muscles here, which I do approve of. And then we just add a tiny bit here. But I'm not going to add any of that highlight to the bottom part of his miniature, because we want the bottom parts to feel slightly darker than the main focal areas. And then just do the same thing up here around the face. Add the highlight all the way up. And then just bring in some of those volumes a little bit more. The photo here is a little bit overexposed because the light is a little bit close to the face and strong. But just adding a bunch of local highlights to this like general brightness is nice. Might be a little bit difficult to see, but if we check the before and after, you can see that it does make quite a big difference in terms of just making it pop a little bit more. Not that it was bad before, just bringing it up slightly more. And now let's talk about the gold, because we have I would say two main issues with this one. The first one is the color selections. They don't look goldy, if I put it that way. When making gold, we want to have warm tones, meaning oranges and yellows, except for in the shadows, because in the shadows we want to have a really dark brown or maybe even a black. Personally, I prefer a dark brown, like a burnt umber, but in this case he's used like a burgundy as a shadow, and I think that the shadow tone is not dark enough to start with, and I also feel like it's a little bit too red and saturated. You want to have like a lot of saturation in your golds. So instead of starting with that color, we want to move to a much darker saturated brown that has a little bit more of an orange hint. That might be, yeah, something like that. You can kind of see the difference. What he's done then is to jump directly into his highlight tone, which just makes it look like he's painted with a yellow on top of a reddish mid-tone, which can be like, if you're perfect at placing highlights, that can be kind of okay, but it's also really difficult to get nice and smooth transitions and get the gold sheen feel. Instead, what we want to do is to bring in an orange brown, sort of like a leather tone, as our first highlight. And this one should not be nearly as bright as this yellow here. We want to have something more in the veins of this tone. And when we have that tone, we get a lot more of the gold feel, because this feels more like a shadowy gold tone. And this color here should be added to about the same areas as we've seen him added the gold tones here. But we don't want to push it nearly as bright. We want it to be like a third of the brightness that he's used. So our third highlight, that one isn't either going to be as bright as this highlight is. Instead, we want to mix something like this one. This is more like an ice yellow, and mix that together with this tone. So if we bring our orange brown, and I think we would get it somewhere to this brightness, you can see how much more this is starting to look like a goldy sheen. And then we just go slightly brighter and brighter. We mix in more of that like ice yellow to our mix for every layer of highlight we add. And we top it off with something like an ice yellow. And with this you can see how much more goldy and shiny this looks as opposed to the original that Ed has done. And we can also, if we want to bring in a warm yellow, let's see if we can find like a warm yellow. Personally, I prefer Sun Yellow from Vallejo, because I really like that tone. Usually what we do with that is we glaze in, which means that we take a really thin color and do it something like a 1% coverage, just to glaze in more of that in the highlight, because usually when we add the ice yellow it gets a little bit saturated, so just glazing in a little bit of gold yellow. You can see it's a minor difference, but it does a big difference on the miniature in real life when you see it, adding that extra like sheen punch to the highlight. So you can see the difference. His gold versus our gold. If we look at the percentages as well, so on this one we can see that we have about, I would say maybe 10% shadow, and then it's this bright area here covers about 80% of the miniature, and then he has all the edges covered with full white, full on white. We do not want full on white on every edge, because if we add full on white to every edge, nothing is going to feel like it has a contrast. So let's take this area down here as an example. This is maybe like a half sphere. So let's show an example of how the light would be hitting. So generally with spheres, we have the light hitting the center, top, here, and then directly towards the viewer. So the light would be hitting somewhere around here. So we would have to start by having the whole thing in shadow. Something like this. And then the top half, you can pretty much cover the entire top half with like a dark orangey brown, something like this, to bring in and make this the mid-tone of everything. We then have to be a little bit more careful, because this one has a lot of like local areas. You can see that we have these like edges between them, and we want to make sure that these ones stay the dark brown. We don't cover that with any of the highlight. We want to make sure that this line here in between is fully darkened. We're just doing the general shapes first. Then we would highlight each single one of these areas around this placement to that highlight level. All the flat surfaces, all the everything, but leave all the dark areas in between with our dark tone. Further we go in terms of brightness, the smaller surface we add the highlight to. So with this one we would go in and highlight each, maybe just edge or like a third of these areas, something like this, with the next highlight tone. So something like this maybe, and then we would have like the top third of whatever is in here. Yeah. Something like this with that highlight. Now we would have this area down here. And if we need to, we can go to like these smaller areas and do like the top part of these with our mid-tone, something like this. And we can do a bit of a bounce light at the bottom, something like that. If you want to add an extra reflection here, it's fine. So now we have a start. And if we want to go like an extra step, we can just add tiny dots to the edges like this. You can see how small a surface that I'm adding this kind of gold to. And then when we go to the final punchy highlight, we go to the ice yellow. And this, previously you can see that it was on almost, you can see this entire flat surface here has that. This entire flat surface here has that ice yellow. On the top up here you can see that the entire edge has that. But we just want the very, very, very top edges to have this brightness. So we do something just like this. Just the very tippity top of these ones. If you want to punch it even a step further, we can add in a tiny bit of ivory if you want to go crazy, but then this is just like the 3 dots on this area as that gold. And you can see kind of the before and after. This is obviously a quick fix, but it does make a massive difference in terms of the volume of the piece. It does a massive difference in terms of the saturation and the color. Especially I feel like when you have this saturated green, you want to have the gold to be just as saturated and poppy and get those volumes in there that you have with the miniature as well. The same kind of thing applies to this one up here. Just think of the general areas first and the general shapes. So this face here is sort of like a sphere. So you highlight it the same way. The top part should have more of the highlight tones. And then the same thing goes up here. You can do, we can highlight it in a couple of different ways. Because the shape is a little bit maybe difficult for people to grasp. So maybe I would add like the highlight tone to the top, and I think I would do one that goes across like this. And then for the one that goes across, we just add the highlight to the center, and for the one that goes at the top, we add the highlight at the very top. And do something like this. And think in general shapes first, and then you do the highlighting of the raised areas. And in this case, we don't want to push the edges all the way to this brightness. We want to keep them around this area, around this brightness and color, like the orangey brown. Everything you painted this tone, you bring that down to this, or slightly darker like this one. I think that's gonna make a huge difference. And just repaint the entire area with the darker, super dark brown first. So you have something like this instead of something like this as your base color. I think that's gonna make a huge difference for your piece. Sorry for interrupting you in the middle of the video, but I just wanted to give a heads up. We are in the middle of our campaign right now, where we just released 3 paint sets carefully curated by me and Lucas that are the paints that we use on a daily basis and the ones we use in pretty much every video. So if you want to paint like us, check out the campaign. In there you can also find our beautiful wet palette, as well as the limited edition Squidmar Infinity 2024 airbrush. Probably the best airbrush in the world. So you do not want to miss that one out, because only like 2 more weeks to go and then you cannot get the airbrush anymore. That's it. Back to the video. Now let's move on to miniature number 2. Okay, our second miniature is from Guy, and he has painted a nurgle demon that I think is really cool. Let's just dig into it and talk about what we can do to improve this mini. So one thing that I always try to keep in mind when I give critiques or when I look at miniatures is to think about the purpose and the use for this miniature. And this specific one is for his army. So the level of the paint job is not going to be nearly as high as the one we just checked from Ed, because that one is for a painting competition. So the critiques that we talked about for Ed, where we go into the nitpicking of the gold to make it perfect for a competition, this piece is more for an army. But there are a few things that we could do to just make the miniature pop a little bit more. And in this case, I want to talk about the balance between lights and shadows. Because in this miniature, we have pretty much the same brightness across the miniature. We have this bright, nurgly green tone that goes across pretty much every surface. And again, it's fine, it's a completely good-looking miniature for an army, but we got this miniature here and we're making this video to help us improve. And as a painter, you have different techniques to approach getting volumes and having the right sort of like brightness in the right areas. And for me personally, I try to make sure that I have the right areas sort of right in the beginning. But if you painted using this technique where you made everything bright, you can still go in and shade things and add shadow to bigger areas. The easiest way of doing this is by using the airbrush and just generally spray it from below. You can use like a neutral brown tone, like a brown ink or a dark brown, and just spray from below. That would tie everything together. So it could be everything from these scrolls, if we just get like shadow underneath them, generally just from below. We'll do a lot to just bring volume to everything. And if we spray this on all the areas, we can spray it from below the miniature as well. On the skin tone, we can use the same brown tone, or if you just want to shade the skin, you can do like a military green, like a dark military green, like a dark olive or something. I'm not sure what these colors are named. But just bringing in some of that shadow from below. If you don't have an airbrush, you have to do this by glazing with a regular brush, which is totally fine, but it's going to take you about 10 times as much time. But just getting some shadows in there, you can see that we get a lot more volume to the miniature. We get more focus to the face, more focus to the belly, and it just adds more life to the mini. And I do think Guy has an airbrush. I think we've talked about this on the Discord, and using that for your mini is gonna do a ton. The last thing that I would do for an army piece is just bring in the highlights around the face just a tiny bit, just punching with like a really bright green tone that's almost like a white with a green tint or a yellow tint, just to punch around the face area. And whenever we add highlights, we remember to just add it to the most top edge, because you're gonna add it all the way up to the edge of the horn. And yeah, a little bit on the arm maybe. Just doing these small adjustments. We do the same thing when we add to the belly. And if we want to add to the muscles, we can add just a tiny bit of highlight. So something like this. Again, we check the before and then the after. And just bringing in a little bit of volume to the miniature does a lot for it, especially when it's on a table from a bit afar. You're gonna see that it pops a lot more by just adding those shadows in there. Just make it feel a little bit more, I wouldn't say realistic, but make it feel like it's part of the environment and has a shadow like things have in real life. That makes a big difference. So it's time for our last miniature, and this one is from Dennis, and it is one of the space dwarfs from the fantasy world. The Caradron Overlords. And Dennis asked for feedback, and this one as well is for an army, so we're gonna go a little bit easy on him, but there are some things that we can think about. And the two main things, again, is I want to cover color selection, and then I want to cover the highlight placement. So the first one being the color selection, where we got this kind of like, I would say maybe a cold mid-tone green. It's not a super cold green, but it's also not a warm one. But it's kind of saturated, but not in a really nice way. And then we have the highlight being this very, very vibrant scorpion, goblin-y green tone. These two do not marry very well together, even though we previously talked about having a colder shadow and a warmer highlight. I can't really put my finger on why these do not work together. Sometimes they don't. When you start on a paint job like this, personally I prefer to instead have a slightly darker green. You can see kind of the difference. Having this as a shadow that I personally would say is more of like a mid-tone. For the shadows I would go all the way to this tone, so a much darker green, and I would start with this tone as the shadow. And I can see Dennis that you're using the airbrush, which is really nice to see, which means that we can, for your next piece, like if you want to switch things up a bit, we can make life easy for you. So when we have this as a shadow tone, I feel like we have a lot more warmth into the mini. And like if you want to desaturate it, you can take a slightly more desaturated, like military green, which is fine, like whichever you prefer, but it needs to be slightly darker. And then if you want to go to like a scorpion green or like a brighter green, we can do that, but then we have to think about the shapes and kind of where the light would be coming from. And I am assuming that the light would be coming from above because this is a sky vessel and the sun would be just above the miniature. And when we have a sphere, the light would never be hitting below kind of the midline. Maybe you would have a slow fade going down a little bit. But here we have the highlight placed in sort of like the middle of the area. Instead, what we want to do is to just have a slow fade from the top. So it's slightly brighter from above than it is below. But we want that fade to be really smooth. So next time when you paint this green, what I would do is to spray the whole thing with the dark green. And then from above, you spray with the airbrush with this brighter green, instead of adding it in the second step. When you've done that as your base coat, you can then just block the rest of the stuff in with like the metal and the gold and all of that. And you're still gonna have that perfect gradient. And the same thing goes for the part down here. We want the spraying to come from above, similar to how the light would be. So if we check the original, we have the highlight here and we have a highlight added down here. But we want the highlight to be on the top part, on all of the raised areas upwards. So this area. You can also hit a little bit on this edge here. And then we just want like a small fade between the dark and the bright and everything that's angled towards the side. So something like that, and the same thing goes for the bottom hull here. You see we have brighter at the top and then darker at the bottom. And we don't need to add anything more to this bottom area here. It should be dark and we should just have like a bit of a gradient up towards more like a green mid-tone. So that's just a few quick tips. Simplifying things instead of adding it to every flat surface. To the center of the flat surface we have a highlight. We want the light to come from above, and then the sides can be quite dark. If you want, you can make a gradient. Just spray with the airbrush from above. And you need to do things in the right order, because if you do this highlighting once you've added the gold and the white, you're obviously going to get an overspray and get this bright green on all the metals and all of the white stuff. So you want to start with the green, highlight that, and then you add in the gold and all of that stuff. And I think you're gonna see a big difference in the paint job, just doing things in the right order and simplifying it. That's it. I hope you learned something. If you did, smash like on this video, subscribe, and join our Patreon if you want to be part of this type of video, because every month we do one of these critiques. If you're lucky, you might be one of those patrons who get to be part of the video. Have a good day. Bye bye.